Okay, so here we are. We're situated in Lecture 3, and this is Part 2. We're going to talk about the empiricism, and we're going to talk about Hume and Hobbes, and David Hume, what does he got to say to us? Well, a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. And that's a fascinating quote, because what do you rely on? Do you rely on belief? Do you rely on evidence? And there's probably contexts that are appropriate for each and make each probably the better choice. I think becoming wise in our years is knowing when to rely on belief, but then also knowing if evidence is available, maybe that might be the better route to go. Right? Because we have both of those tools available as part of our life negotiation toolkit. Hume's empiricism. Useful knowledge comes through sensual empirical experience. So, I move out in the world. My sensory and perceptual apparatus helps me experience the world and interpret the world, and it's through that that I gain knowledge. Right? So, moral sentimentalism, moral truths are derived through the senses, that is, through experiencing life. And notice that pain and pleasure probably inform us to a great extent, so we can think in terms of those. They reveal themselves through interactions with each other, and this is very true of social animals, right? Is that we learn to position ourselves relative to each other on the basis of our interactions, and that's when we truly learn about ourselves, right? Sympathy. This is a big word, and we're going to return to this several times throughout the course. The experience of sympathy is thus a bridge between the social and the psychological. That is, the social allows me to interact and observe, but to understand, that is, to intellectualize it and build my psychological toolkit as a result, is through the process of sympathy. So Hobbes' assumption, and now we're moving away from Hume to Hobbes just briefly, and Hobbes has got kind of a nasty view of the world. There's no two ways about it. His view of mankind was not very complimentary. This quote is just horrifying. Life for humanity is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And certainly if we go back to the 17 and 1800s, this is very much the case, but even in the 21st century, depending on where you live and your social status, your class, however you want to put that, life can be tremendously brutal, short, nasty, and leave people to feel solitary in their existence. Right? Given this stance then, if this is true, and Hobbes believes it to be true, this is kind of the underpinning, this is his launching point, so to speak. Given this stance, people are in need of significant external controlling forces. That is, people can't be trusted to do the right thing. Right? People are essentially assholes, and how do we keep the assholiness out of people? We develop systems in which people are embedded that create fear in those people. So the idea is that we create a government, we create a set of laws, and we create a body that can enforce those laws. And the idea is if you step out of line, if you behave like an asshole, we're going to come down on you like a ton of bricks, and we're going to keep you in line. So Hobbes has got a very uncomplimentary view of us, that we respond to fear and it appears little else, right? So this is heavily mechanistic. Metaphysical explanations are stripped away. They're not necessary at all. And notice it really is kind of a story of operant conditioning. Hey, you step out of line, we apply a shock. You step out of line, we apply a shock. You step out of line, we apply a shock. Over time, you should learn not to step out of line because the shocks are unpleasant. It's very basic, right? So, Hobbes' assumption of inherent selfishness, people will do the right thing to the extent that they receive pleasure or pain as a result of the right thing or the wrong thing. So Hobbes' motivations, emotions then, as mechanisms, is expect a mechanistic explanation for human responding. Again, very behaviorist kind of in its approach. We're driven by stimuli that push or pull, attraction and aversion. So what become important in Hobbes' world? Liking and disliking, loving and hating, joy and sadness become the mechanisms. And to the extent that a society can manipulate those, it can exert control over its selfish little individuals. Other early sentimentalists, like Hutchinson, are less bleak, suggesting benevolence, altruism are possible and are guided by our seventh sense, that is, a moral sense. I'll leave that up to conjecture. And again, note that this is rife for the expression of opinion. Do you believe then, Hutchinson, Are you more kind of Hobbesian? What's your stance? And that really is kind of an underlying assumption that guides how one would function. Right? So the condition of man, it's a condition of war, everyone against everyone. And boy, is that uplifting or what? But note, in this day and age, in our 21st century, maybe that becomes kind of tough to argue with as we exist right now, in large part. And many of us are finding this current, especially the year 2020, a year that is extremely depressing. And maybe this explains part of that. And notice, maybe this explains a year or a couple years or a certain era. And I think that's the beauty of learning all these different ideas, because there's no one-size-fits-all explanation. And maybe this is a good explanation of where we are right now. And you might even disagree with that and think that there's a better explanation of why we are now. Or maybe you perceive where we are now entirely differently than I do or someone else does. And that's cool, because that shows, at least I hope, that we're thinking. So the tendency to joy and hope is true happiness, right? And the tendency to fear and melancholy is real unhappiness. And this shows kind of an individual difference, according to Hume, on the perspectives we take, right? Are you a pessimist or an optimist is kind of pulled in together. So as I promised, we come back to Hume here. So Hume is the post-skeptic. So as an ultimate skeptic, is there no certainty? And notice one of his works here, an important work, is a treatise on human nature. And that sounds ultimately psychological to me, but remember, we're still in the realm of philosophy. We haven't full-blown into empirical psychology yet. It becomes, therefore, no inconsiderable part of science barely to know the different operations of the mind, to separate them from each other, to class them under their proper heads, to correct all that seeming disorder in which lie involved when made the object of reflection and inquiry. So, what are our multi-components? Who are we? What are the pieces of us? Yes, I feel. Yes, I think. Yes, I sense. Yes, I perceive. Can I begin to organize my awareness of all these different elements, right? Can we organize that? How attitudes shape our behavior, right? Our emotional experience. Can we organize that, become mindful of all of that, and then create an overarching view of us that puts us in increasingly control of our experience and our place in the world? But he explores perception, and this is, again, I'm getting back to the stimuli idea. Impressions are most often formed through initial sensory experience. And then ideas are recollections of the initial impressions. So impressions are something that could occur largely automatically through my interaction with my environment, with other people, right? But then the ideas are kind of the cumulative recombination of those impressions, and these will be represented as memories. Right? And note that memories can be live or they can be brought up from the past. This can be described between feeling and thinking. That perhaps the impressions are most akin to feeling, and the ideas and the processing of memories, etc., more akin to thinking. But man, there's probably some fuzzy boundaries there. Note that either are perfect representation of the countered stimulus. Our perceptions, our sensations of a stimulus can be distorted by past experiences, current wants or needs, right? The context. And then the memories have been distorted through various processes of elaboration, of elimination of concepts that were deemed unimportant. So simple and complex ideas are possible, complex being made up of combined simple impressions or ideas. So we can take, let's say, individual memories of our experience with a person. I remember this, I remember this, I remember this. And this is based on the impressions at the time, each of those memories. But then when I want to paint a picture of this person, who is this person and what are they about, then that becomes a complex idea that is the resulting combination of all the smaller ideas. So Hume's associationism, then, what becomes important in part to Hume, is ideas in the mind are causally bound together through these principles, these links of association. And man, we're talking about some really modern psychology here when we start talking in these ideas. Now, these associations, remembrance, contiguity and cause and effect, temporal association, are at the core of Hume's thinking. Now, when we think about principles of association, what group of psychologists should be brought to mind? And let's go into the 1920s, 1930s. This is the Gestalt psychologists are all about, right? That is, processes of resemblance, for example, and how it affects perception. And co-occurrence, temporal precedence, all of these ideas are very Gestalt. Hume is presaging, or a lot of the Gestalt psychologists were probably relatively serious students of Hume. So amazing to consider the whole study of unconscious and non-conscious priming effects that we embraced in the 1990s and the early 2000s as research mechanisms. Almost everyone in my cohort in social psychology did priming studies where we expose people to stimuli and then, rely on the underlying link that they have to a stimuli to observe a consequence in the laboratory. But this grows out of the Gestalt view of the creation of the whole, and that was one of the big challenges for Gestalt psychologists, is how do we take all these little individual perceptual pieces and put them together to create the whole of our experience. I don't think the Gestalt people get enough props for that idea. So what do we got with Hume then? Well, Hume then places reason ideas above the passions. Ideas are subject to the three associationisms. They're built out of that, and that really helps craft them. Passions, on the other hand, are associated only through resemblance. So passions are much simpler. That is, oh my God, I'm afraid of a snake, right? And I've developed that fear, so it's an immediate response. And then anything else that looks like a snake can probably trigger the same response through the process, the linkage of resemblance. Right? So, disappointment, grief might give way to anger, anger to jealousy, and that becomes malice, perhaps transforming back to anger and finally grief. So he's also extending these associations to emotional experience to the stimulus object. It's interesting, though, for Hume that a passion may only be supplanted by another passion. And consider this in the context of desire to manipulate others to action. That is especially people who don't like to engage in thinking, who don't really participate in reason to a great extent. If you want to manipulate these people, and I hate to say that, but a lot of people use this idea to manipulate people, that is that we can make someone feel a passion, we can provide them some stimulus, and we can actually redirect that emotion, give them a new emotional experience by linking the two through propaganda, through repeated pairing of these ideas. So volition is tied to passions, and it seems that ideas cannot motivate in and of themselves. That they must operate through passions. And that's another side issue that's just fascinating. That is, thinking doesn't get me off my ass. But thinking, as it triggers passions, maybe that subset of passions we want to call motivations, gets me off my butt to carry out the ideas. Fascinating relationship. Hume is, thinking pretty damn hard about this. So, where are we? Well, to consider the matter aright, reason's nothing but a wonderful and unintelligible instinct in our souls. It's just something that some of us do, which carries us along a certain train of ideas, endows them with particular qualities. What a great idea, right? According to their particular situations and relations. This instinct, 'tis true, arises from past observation experience. But can anyone give the ultimate reason why past experience and observation produce an effect any more than why nature alone should produce it? So yes, we respond to natural environmental stimuli, but we also respond to our own ideas. And why? I don't think Hume wants to go there. I don't think he wants to answer that question. I think he's saying that we might have difficulty, any of us, answering that question. So at this point then, passions, if they arise out of the interaction with stimuli, can we say that passions are unreasonable? And Hume said no. Passion is triggered by an environmental stimuli. It's below reason. It's not even subjected to the evaluation of being reasonable or unreasonable in Hume's word. So passion and reasons are separate, And reason does not therefore apply to passion. Passion can't be unreasonable. But, and here's where the element of human control and human judgment and human choice come in, perhaps free will if you want to go there, but false judgment can lead to inappropriate passion. So if I encounter a situation and judge it falsely, then it may cause an inappropriate passion to arise. But notice it was the judgment that was incorrect, it wasn't the passion. So sometimes we're mistaken about a person's behavior, right? And that kind of, we say, oh my God, they're a really asshole for doing that. And it was like, no, actually they really didn't have a choice. That was something that was required for them to do. And so that we go back once we have more information and understand that our judgment was flawed. But the passions all along, the emotions are correct because they are what they are, if you will, if you like that kind of simple-minded explanation. Strength of mind then becomes a relatively complex achievement, relying on the prevalence of calm over violent passions, not the ability to reason. And again, we're getting back to that idea to supplant one passion with another. Right? So in one case, it might be anger, but what if I link anger to curiosity? So if I'm being like uber aware of my anger and I say, oh my God, I'm so pissed off, but then I make that a direct link to the passion curiosity, which motivates me to say, why am I angry? That's very curious that I would be so angry. What is it that's causing that anger? And now notice I'm invoking reason. But I had to do it through the linkage of one emotion to another. That is one passion to another. And I think that's critical to remember with Hume is really first and foremost about the linkages and of course the separation of passion and reason. So let's get back to that notion of sympathy that we saw with that first slide prior to Hobbes. What do you think, sweetie? Are you getting tired? Are you going to take a nap anytime soon? All right. So Hume, the profound importance of sympathy. Sympathy is at the core social quality of Hume's philosophy. We believe we have a propensity for sympathy, perhaps more as a quality describing shared emotion or the way emotions can prompt similar emotions in others. Now notice this is a lot different than empathy, and empathy is something we're going to get to later, but sympathy is at least the understanding of, right, someone else's state. It's that bridge, right, from the observed to the psychological. And the closer we are to another, the greater observed power of this process of sympathy. So we know how others close to us are likely to react. We know how they're likely to be affected. And we're more tuned into this because of our closeness. Right? It's the process of sympathy that creates us in the notion of similarity or dissimilarity to others. So I see that their situation is not entirely different than mine. And this is a big problem we often have between groups because we automatically assume that they, the out-group, are different than we are, and we have little sympathy available to us to see our similarities, and we tend then to magnify our differences. So this is a function of our experience of the world and the passions aroused, and notice this is also something I can manipulate. People can be made more sympathetic or less sympathetic through propaganda and other means. So let's get to homework number 2.6. And what do we got? Hume. Unreasonable passions or not. And for this, for the intrepid soul who takes the final element of homework 2, consider a past event where a given passion was elicited by a stimulus object, right? Passion, stimulus object, elicits a passion. Describe the scenario in which this occurred. Again, back to scenario-based kind of responses. But unfortunately, this led to a false judgment. What was the false judgment? So really, in this scenario, I'm giving you an outline to write this little story here, right? That is stimulus object, evokes passion. But as a result of this passion, a false judgment is tied to that passion. Describe what the false judgment was, and then how did reason intervene to straighten out the situation in which the false judgment was made. Okay? So reason comes and says, oh, wait a second, what if that judgment was false? Then the passion is inappropriate to the situation. What was the role of sympathy in that corrective process? And that's the tricky question there. So that's what makes this portion of the assignment intriguing, but also kind of tough. So that's the elements of homework number 2. All 6 all 6 are involved. We're gonna go to our next part here as we finish up this lecture.